We are in turbulent times. Muslims today find themselves floating adrift amidst the crashing waves of modernity. Living in an ever-increasingly hostile political climate, coupled with the rise of individualism, freedom, and liberalism, how do Muslims today find their spiritual anchorage?
Joining us today is Dr Samir Mahmoud, Academic Director of Usul Academy and a lecturer at the Cambridge Muslim College in Islamic Studies and Islamic Psychology. Dr. Samir, welcome to the podcast. It's an honor to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Doctor, let's get started straight into this conversation. And for many of our viewers, the word postmodernism, it might be an unfamiliar term. So in simple terms, how would you define postmodernism? What is it?
I mean, essentially, postmodernism is post-modern, right? So after modern. In order to understand postmodernism, one has to understand what modernism actually was. So if we go back a little bit in history, just a bit of a historical dimension to it, around 17th, 18th century, Europeans, for various reasons, experiences fundamental cultural, philosophical, social, economic, political shifts away from the certainties of the past and into a world largely governed by reason, by rationality. So in the realm of philosophy, there was a shift away from the truths of revelation towards the truths of pure reason. In the realm of culture, there was a shift away from a reliance on the institutions of the church and the meaningful relationships established by those kind of traditional relationships of family and guild and trade, etc., to more rationalized bureaucratic structures of the modern nation state. In economy, there was a shift towards more rational governed economic policies rooted increasingly in capitalism. And in terms of religion, obviously, the move away from revelation in favor of human reason, away from God in favor of the human being. So this ushered in a period of modernity or modernism, as it's become known, which kind of initiated a radical break with the past, complete break with the past. Almost as if the Europeans decided they wanted to turn a new page in history by founding their culture, civilization, their sense of meaning, sense of purpose, sense of morality on new foundations, rooted in the human being and rooted in the faculty within the human being we call reason. So detached from God above, detached from tradition from the past, the Europeans embarked on this grand cultural project. By the 20th century, this project of basing civilization, basing human existence, are exclusively on human reason, detached from the past, detached from tradition, detached from the moral certainties of religious revelation, detached from God, proved to be a fundamental failure, major failure. And in the wake of this breakdown in this grand project and grand narrative, partly triggered by global wars. I mean, the argument was in the 50s and 60s, was if Europe had achieved such a peak of human civilization, rooted in humanism, or rooted in the human being and rooted in human reason, how was it that they could embark on such catastrophic horrors, World War I, World War II? So there was a serious moment in the European history of a moment of self-doubt. And that ushered in a period of questioning. So the 60s, the hippies revolution, that entire period, the resistance against war in Vietnam, all this, and then also the student movements in France, all these were various, let's say, resistance or reactions against that kind of certainty of the modern project. And in its wake, postmodernism was born. Right? Postmodernism is what? If modernism exclusively relied on human reason as a means for understanding the nature and fabric of reality, which is embodied in science, and if modernism believed in the absolute certainties of the human being and the integrity of the human being, as someone or entity cut off from revelation, cut off from God,
Mm-hmm.
then postmodernism, and if modernism believed in a complete radical break with the past, postmodernism provided a number of cracks in those kind of perspectives or that wall of certainty, opening up the possibility of exploring post-truths.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if the absolute certainty of human reason was incorrect, then maybe there's no reason.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's no truth.
I guess it is really that breakaway from objective truth to subjective truth.
Yeah, absolutely. So one can define postmodernism as the rejection of truth with a capital T,
Mm-hmm.
the acceptance of multiple truths, and the rejection of moral certainty, objective standards for what is right and wrong, in favor of moral relativism, the utter and complete rejection of objective standards of beauty, and acceptance of subjectivity of beauty. And this is all as a result of the increasing centering of human thought and action on the individual.
Mm-hmm.
This hence the birth of individualism. Because when you empty out the previous social, cultural, institutional functions performed by traditional societies, and you increasingly transfer that function and authority to the state. And if you define liberation and emancipation from religion and God to be rooted in severing that relationship with religion and God, what you end up doing is you define the true essence of what it means to be a human being as to be an individual who grows and defines themselves on their own terms, independent of any external authority, whether that's God, whether that's tradition, whether that's culture, or in the tradition of someone like Rousseau, society itself.
Yeah.
And so what happens with this individual becomes inflated and inflated and inflated and inflated because you're putting greater emphasis on the capacity of the individual to self-define what meaning is, what purpose is, what is true, what is right, what is wrong, what is beautiful. Hence the birth of individualism.
I think you've touched on a lot of topics there, Dr. Samir. I think I personally find it hard as being a host and to navigate this conversation, and also those of just trying to get my pen and paper and scribing a lot of this down. But I think you have touched on a lot of things. And as Kamal was saying, it's also very important to define these terms that we talk about in the conversation that we intend to have. But alongside Kamal's question, I would ask you, you talk about individualism and you also talk about the self. I think it is also important to identify what is the fitra, what is the nafs. Are they two separate things? I think often today we also get them conflated with one another, like a corporeal kind of thing. So Dr. Smith, if I could ask you on a surface level, what is the ruh? What is the nafs? What is fitra? Because we are not born sages, right? I mean, we know that every child that is born from their mother is born on fitra. And our fitra is distinctive from the trees and from the rivers and from the animals, I guess. But what is fitra? What is
three
the
terms?
Yeah,
the ruh, the nafs, and the fitra.
Well, I mean, the ruh, nafs, and fitra define what it means to be human, right? So, in the Islamic tradition, at least, we when the Jewish community asked the Prophet ﷺ, "Wama ruh?" the response came, "Ruh min amr rabbi," right? So it's a matter of thy Lord, which human beings have little knowledge of. It doesn't mean that we can't have any knowledge of it. In classical Islamic psychology, in classical Islamic thought, the way the human being was understood is in the following terms. The ruh as a pure ethereal substance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends min amri rabbiha into the womb. Once the ruh becomes manifest in a body and it's wedded to the psychosomatic functions of the body and the human being.
Psychosomatic. Sorry, Dr. Smith, I think you lost me on that word. You may have to break that down a little bit for me.
Somatic is the bodily.
The bodily, right.
And psychic is the psychological constitution. Once the ruh becomes embodied in a concrete body, it's now called nafs.
Okay.
Right?
It's coming back to the hadith, فَيَنْفِخُ فِيهِ الرُّوحِ. The angel blows into the ruh at 40 days into the body. So once we have that connection, comes the nafs.
Yeah. Once it's blown in, the ruh, insofar as it is manifest in a body, is referred to as the nafs. Right? So we have a body, we have a nafs, we have a ruh. Ruh in a body is called nafs. That's why in most psychology, in most psychotherapeutics, and most of the literature on well-being and therapeutics of the soul in the Islamic tradition, or the nafs, they talk about the nafs. They don't talk about the ruh much, as much. Once the human being is able to come to terms, because at the end of the day, in order to develop on your journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, beginning with the fitrah, when you're born, all the way on your journey of ascent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in terms of your own growth, you require a path, you require guidance, you require a means of how to achieve that. And that's of course manifest in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, in the best example set by the good companions of Rasul ﷺ, at-Tabi'een, etc., in the Islamic tradition. They chart a path, they provide a pathway on how to improve the self and refine it. And this Islamic tradition is one of the richest in the world in terms of purification of the nafs. In order to do what? In order to reactualize the purity of the ruh that it once possessed.
Wow.
Right? So some scholars associate, in the Quran, of course, there are 3 levels to the nafs. There's nafs al-ammara bis-su', which is the lowest level. And nafs al-ammara bis-su' is basically the nafs, or that part of ourself that is at the mercy of the lower instincts and desires. Having instincts and desires is not a bad thing in the Islamic tradition. We're very much a culture that is pro-life. But the nafs al-ammara is when we are at the mercy of these instincts and desires and not able to control them. If we work upon ourselves and improve and refine ourselves, we are able to be at the level of a nafs al-lawama. A nafs al-lawama is the self that takes itself to account. It reminds you, talum, it reminds you, it takes you to account. There's an element of judgment, there's an element of cognitive rational capacity to control and understand that we're in partial control here. And above that even is a nafs al-mutma'inna. A nafs al-mutma'inna is the level of the self or the nafs where we have actualized a certain sense of peace and stillness through iman, of course, through taqwa. And the highest level of a nafs al-mutma'inna touches a ruh. Right? So if you were to have a diagram of the nafs, you would say the ruh is at the top, and then you have the 3 levels of the nafs, and then the body at the lowest, right? And our journey through life really is a journey through an actualization of these various levels of ourself, essentially.
قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا.
قَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا, exactly.
Yes. Successful is the one who purifies this nafs.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the Islamic tradition, all extracted from the Quran, it just systematizes it and structures it a little bit, because in the Quran it's dispersed. The wisdom and hikmah and the jewels are dispersed everywhere. Now, this is our Islamic conception and understanding of the self. The problem with modernity is it tries to discover and chart the path of the self for its own development on its own terms. That if you're at the level of a nafs al-ammara and you haven't yet seen the higher levels yet, how can you chart a path along to a destination you haven't seen, you haven't witnessed? And you're not even considering anyone else to tell you about, right? The self on its own resources, cut off from God and cut off from the wisdom of tradition, is not able to properly understand what it is, and let alone chart a path of liberation.
If I could touch upon that point, Dr. Samir, that would lead on to my question that I was just thinking as you were explaining. I guess nowadays we live in an age where individual truth is used as a measure to justify what is morally right and what is morally wrong. I think that creates a big problem as well. And just as you were talking, I was writing some things down. I guess, what implications does that have on a Muslim, on the Muslim's worldview, whereas you kind of obstructing the objective and now using your own subjective morality as a measure for truth?
Well, one of the hallmarks of modernity, and more so post-modernity, is this idea that we are the authors, or we have the capacity to define what is truth, what is good, what is beautiful. And that's the illusion. right? And it's catastrophic because our entire Islamic tradition is based on a very different understanding of what the self is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who created the self, has told us about it and defined it for us. And those who have received the prophetic revelation are the ones who have shown us the path of how to purify it. The error of individualism is it assumes that the individual can do that. And the only criteria it provides, because in Islamic tradition, our criteria is what? Revelation. It's Allah. It's the Sunnah. We align ourselves with something higher beyond ourselves, and we take that as the measure of truth. If you don't have anything like that, your only measure of what to do is by turning inwards and seeing how you feel about things. Right? Hence, these kind of the danger of this kind of subjectivism or subjectivity. And unfortunately, that was highlighted as the only path of moving forward in Western individualism for centuries. You turn inward. If you read Wordsworth, if you read Rousseau, if you read many of these authors who...
Sorry, what was the second author?
Rousseau. Okay. And many of the authors into, the influence of Freud on modern culture and postmodern culture, the turn inwards in order to search within oneself for how one feels about something can hardly provide the kind of criteria, objective criteria, for whether what you're doing is right or wrong.
Yeah,
it's your nafs, it's your waswas, right? So there's a fundamental problem there. Now, in the Islamic tradition, alhamdulillah, we believe that the self is not what you make it out to be. Individualism will tell you you are what you make yourself to be. And especially this emerges by the 20th century with the birth of existentialism, with Sartre and others. That you are what you want yourself to be. And that comes as a culmination of a long tradition of the turn inwards towards subjectivism.
You're no longer created in the image of God. You are your own artist.
Exactly. Yeah. That the idea that we're created in the image of God and that Adam was given all the names and somehow we have this elevated status potentially to actualize this perfection is gone. And so what ends up happening is you end up in a dark inner subjective realm closed in on itself. Right? A great scholar once said, the Enlightenment and up until the early 20th century cut us off from above, from God.
You removed yourself from the garden as well. I've read so far.
And Freud opened us up to the hell below, right? And the hell, the darker subconscious realm of our inner desires and our inner darkest instincts, right? So how do we navigate that? The Islamic tradition provides a very different model. The notion of the fitrah is very important. In the Islamic tradition, there is this idea that we cannot define who we are entirely, but we are created upon a certain nature. We are created upon a certain disposition, a primordial disposition, the fitrah. And if we veer off that path, we experience all sorts of psychological hells and misery and pain. Hence the birth of many of the contemporary pathologies of the modern world, whether it's nihilism, alienation, psychosis, neurosis. Many of these have to do with this fundamental shift and error by putting the great burden of defining what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is beautiful upon the individual. The individual can't carry this burden. We're not made to carry this kind of burden. Hence the sense of loss, alienation, lack of meaning. I mean, nihilism is the lack of sense of meaning and purpose.
I guess you've also touched on a very important topic there. I guess we're kind of pushed to this corner of darkness. I guess the world will kind of push you to a corner and it will ask you and who you are. And if you don't know, I guess it will give you that meaning. But you've also talked about, for example, Sigmund Freud and other political movements as well. I guess my question to you would be, how can we navigate a space where we are, we're in the light of, how can I put this simply? We see a lot of Muslims nowadays at university, aligning themselves either with the extreme left or the extreme right. And we can understand that a lot of these things that they put out there are very, I guess, sympathetic. You can understand why Muslims would align themselves with that. For example, if you're at a rally, you have perhaps the communists or the LGBTQ movement joining your Palestinian rally, and then you kind of attend theirs and you kind of say, it's okay, they attend theirs. That's how people kind of perceive it to be. But how do we navigate this space yet remain faithful to our own tradition without falling into the traps of modernity and all these?
Essentially, we need to do what we're doing at Usul Academy. Our motto.
Shameless plug, but it's respected.
Yeah, I mean, our motto is al-tajdeed al-mu'assal, right? Renewed revival, or rooted revival, which is the idea that any attempt to revive, obviously we need to revive our tradition, but any revival has to be rooted. Rooted in what? Rooted in the immutable classical principles of our tradition. I'm reminded, a lot of the movements today remind me of the initial reaction of Muslim scholars when they first encountered modernity. Today we live in a postmodern age, so a lot of the movements you mentioned are quite postmodern. But if you look at the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, in the way in which Muslim intellectuals and shuyukh responded to the onslaught of modernity, you see that one of the things that characterizes their reaction, their response, and it was reactionary. Why? Because they didn't have time to digest the essence of what modernity was. Many of them superficially saw advancement in science and advancement in technology, and they naively thought that if you just adopted the science and technology, you can do whatever you wanted to do with it. What they didn't realize is that embedded in the science and technology, and embedded in the very nature of the nation state, which we took on board or was imposed upon the Muslim world, were a whole set of assumptions, values, an entire worldview that comes with it. Unless we are rooted in our Islamic tradition and its principles, and simultaneously are able to fundamentally and profoundly understand the essence of the modern world and the postmodern world, we're not going to be able to chart an alternative for the Muslim youth. Many Muslim youth, in the absence of a metaphysical tradition, a cosmological tradition, an intellectual tradition.
We lack that, I think, especially in these kind of circles.
In absence of being rooted in something like that, they're not able to, they're not equipped with the tools, the intellectual resources, and the correct perspectives from which they then evaluate a lot of the ideas that they seem to be engaged with. What happens is they may come across a movement that emphasizes a question of justice.
Yes. I mean, people fall into critical theory and gender theory, all these types of theories. How can, it's quite calamitous on the soul itself, as we touched upon.
It is.
But where do you think that comes from? Is it this bruised sense of entitlement, or what is it? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It comes from the fact that it addresses an important issue, injustice. And while they're drawn to it because of the fact that it's addressing this injustice and unmasking it, what they don't realize is they accept everything that comes with it.
They kind of fall into the trap of it
in the process. It's like our father and grandfather's generation when they imbibe Marxism,
especially for the Arabs as well.
Especially, in the Arab world, yeah. I mean, they, and they took this Marxist idea of anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, and against the injustices, and took it on board with its entire worldview. Right? Profoundly problematic. Karl Marx has a number of good things to say, but take it all on board is profoundly problematic. And it's the lack of the rootedness of the people who did that. If you look at the late 19th, early 20th century, many scholars who were rooted in the classical tradition didn't fall prey to this error. Unfortunately, they've been neglected. And we're actually organizing a conference this summer to revive interest in them. Right? Classically trained scholars who responded and critiqued modernity in very interesting ways, from a classical kalam perspective, from a classical philosophical perspective, from a classical usul fiqh perspective, etc. These youth, unless they root themselves once again in the classical tradition, they won't have the correct tools and broad metaphysical framework within which to make sense of all this. I remember I was a student in anthropology many years ago. I did my fieldwork in the South Pacific. And at some point, I decided to quit anthropology. At that point, although I had some traditional training with some shuyukh, it wasn't yet in the intellectual disciplines. It was in the basics, ulum hadith and Quran. And anthropology was insidiously, the perspectives of anthropology, because if you study anthropology long enough, it teaches you the absolute relativism of all cultures. Moral right and wrong is just a cultural construct of some culture somewhere. And so it makes you question, well, where's the universal validity and objectivity of my own standard? So I quit it because I felt like it was beginning to disturb my soul. It's only later, after I studied the mature Islamic intellectual tradition, that it gave me this framework within which now to appreciate anthropologies, limited and relative truths and perspectives, and put them in their place, right? And that's important. Many of these youth don't know where to put these perspectives because they don't have the broader framework. And mesh, right? And so in the absence of that, they're just going to be drawn into one ideology after another,
and be swept under the wave
with very serious detrimental effects.
And we've seen that with many political movements come out. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's very important for us as Muslims to have that framework, to have that guidance and those guidelines, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like in the Quran, like he condemns these people so many times. Like, do they have a book from which they discern right from wrong with? In another instance, we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, do you see the one who takes his desires as his God? And I feel like in today's day and age, we definitely see the main idol that's being worshipped is the self and the individual self, the subjective self. And if we don't have that ability to discern right from wrong, we do definitely get swept under the tidal wave of postmodernism and everything that it has to offer. Another, I guess, common movement we're seeing rampant today is the rise of cancel culture. That's another movement, the woke movement. And we're seeing a lot of Muslims, I guess, adopt this framework. We're seeing them use this framework to, like, I guess, insidiously tarnish the reputation of different mashaykh, different scholars. They've taken this movement on board and they don't have that Islamic framework to navigate right from wrong. Because perhaps there are some, aspects of cancel culture that we are sympathetic towards, calling out wrongdoing. But then when we don't understand the entire framework of Islam and we adopt the entire framework of cancel culture instead, then we see a recipe for disaster. Do you see that where I'm coming from? Do you feel that?
Absolutely. And as Muslims, we shouldn't necessarily get bogged down in taking sides with these. A lot of these issues, in my opinion, you can clearly document and chart how we got to the point today where a statement like, I'm confused about my gender, makes sense.
Definitely.
Makes sense, not makes sense from an Islamic perspective, makes sense in contemporary culture. But if you look at the steps taken from individualism, subjectivity, Freud, sexualization of identity, and wedding that to left-wing politics, the inevitable result is woke cancel culture and this whole gender confusion.
Gender fluid.
Once you separate, once you define, or once you say that the human being subjective ideas and feelings defines what you are, not your fitrah, not an essential nature, what you decide it is, automatically what you're doing is you're severing the relationship between any intrinsic essence that you have, any intrinsic nature to your body, and what you feel it may be. With Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre plus Freud, you get separating what the body is, your sexuality, from what you may or may not think you are, gender. This final severance that happened in the 50s and 60s is the direct result of that is, I am the gender I define myself to be.
As I feel.
Yeah, and feel. Why? Because what I feel and what I think I am is ultimately what defines what I am. There's no essence to me. And the fact that I'm in this body, with the masculine or feminine features is irrelevant. Right? And you can chart that kind of development, how we got here. And every step of the way is as absurd as the one before it. From an Islamic perspective, the point of departure was mistaken, and every other step after that can be easily critiqued. We don't need to fall into that kind of debate and discussion. We do need to engage at some level now because too many Muslims are involved in it. But I think a lot of our energy should go towards offering an alternative. Muslims aren't yet offering humanity an alternative. We're neither left nor right. There are certain aspects of the left that some Muslims might find appealing to their sensibility, sense of justice. There are certain things about the right in terms of its values,
conservatism,
its conservative nature.
The family.
We're neither this nor that, right? And getting too bogged down in these is problematic.
It comes back to it doesn't matter. Anyone can say truth. Even the shaitan can say truth. In the famous hadith, we see صدق وهو كذوب, you know, the shaitan spoke the truth, but he's a liar. So it doesn't matter who is saying what. So many a time Muslims will feel like, no, we have to side with the left, or we have to side with the right. How can you side with the left when, you know, or how can you side with the right when they're Islamophobes? We're not here to side with the left nor the right. We're here to stand up for our principles. If our principles somewhat happen to align, then okay. But we're not going to be tied down to this movement. Doctor, there is another hallmark of postmodernism that I feel is very important for us to draw upon, and that is the severance between our connection, our, I guess, fitra, our bodies, with the natural world. You know, in the postmodern era we find ourselves in today, there's a heavy reliance on technology, consumerism. We're in like the Uber Eats generation where everything is streamlined towards us. We are extremely privileged, and we have this disconnect between the human body and the natural world. What implications does that have on our fitra or our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
It has huge implications. It inhibits the fitrah. The fitrah is, if you go back to trying to understand what the fitrah actually is, it's a remarkable dimension of our being where we come into this world already predisposed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
There are studies that show that children, I think Justin Barrett was the one who said that children have that innate belief in Allah or God, the Creator.
Absolutely. Innate predisposition toward Allah, an innate predisposition towards the good that has to be nurtured. That's why at a certain age the fitrah can be covered over. You know, your parents make you a Christian or a Majus or etc. According to hadith. And so, but the fitrah is also a more primordial, natural way of being. If you remember the hadith in the story of the Mi'raj, where the Prophet ﷺ was offered 2 cups, a cup of wine, cup of laban, like milk. He chose the milk, and if you think about it, you know, wine is often associated with Christianity. Right? It's fermented. It's an artificial drink that had to go through a number of artificial processes in order to become the drink that it actually is. Whereas milk is naturally sustaining in its natural form. Right? So Islam is that return to the primordial fitrah that underpins all human beings and our human nature. And if you look at every aspect of our tradition, if you look at the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, if you look at our ibadat, they're all closely wedded to primordial patterns of nature, whether it's the movement of the sun across the sky that determines the prayer times, the movement of the moon, you know, and our fasting. And so the movement of the sun and the planets and the spheres is not just a random blob of material substances moving around in space.
Accidents.
No. I mean, they're literally manifestations of divine actions and movements. And so what better way than to have our own way of life aligned and attuned to the divine rhythm in the cosmos. And the movements of prayer, for example, align themselves well with the movements of nature. We perform ablution with natural water. We recite Quran with the very primordial sounding words. We're oriented towards a certain direction, etc. Every aspect of our life, the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is fitraic. In the latter days of human history, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is returning us back to the primordial fitrah. And so if we follow the Sunnah is like protection. It's a way of life in the midst of the modern world that keeps us very close to the rhythms of nature and closely aligned to it. If Muslims stick to that, they will never sever their relationship to nature. And this is why, I'm going to say something that may sound a bit controversial, but I'm going to...
By all means, this is the most controversial podcast, I'm joking.
If our ulama, and our ulama need to take into account the particular moment that we find ourselves in human history, so utterly disconnected from the natural world, so utterly connected from the rhythms of nature, so utterly out of tune with other modalities of time other than this, that we should be encouraged to look and determine the prayer times by looking outside the window.
Wow.
Not I'm not saying don't look at your clock.
We've got the apps. Do the apps. Just the apps.
Our relationship to nature should never be mediated. Full stop.
Wow.
Right? I'm not against technology. I'm not a Luddite by any stretch of the imagination. You know, the 19th century Luddites went around destroying machines and and industries. No, and not about that.
The
But
cameras safe.
it seems to be colonizing every aspect of our life. And we have to draw a line.
Definitely.
We have to draw a line. And the line is, so far as I'm concerned, is when it begins to intruding on our relationship to Allah and our relationship to divine actions in nature, natural world. A Muslim is the last person on the planet whose natural way of life echoes the primordial way of life of primordial man in the beginning of times of history. The Muslim should be the last person who shouldn't look out the window. Right? Or when Ramadan comes, we shouldn't go up onto the roof to sight the moon with the eye.
Allah.
I'm not saying the fatwa or the decision on when Ramadan happens has to be determined exclusively by looking at the moon. That's something for shuyukh to work out. I'm saying as a people, as Muslims.
Even the feeling you get
Can
just
you
by
imagine?
looking at
Can you imagine the
moon.
ummah the night before Ramadan turning off the lights and 2 billion Muslims standing on the rooftops,
Allah.
right, looking for the sign of Allah?
Allah.
Can you imagine? I mean, that image.
After you mentioned to the people at work over here, I said, you know, the moon that you look at is the same moon that the Prophet ﷺ looked at.
Absolutely.
Connected.
Looking out at the sun and trying to determine the prayer time,
Your shadow length.
and then correcting it by looking at your watch. But if my first relationship to the rhythms of nature are mediated, I'm completely severed from nature, and that's deeply and profoundly problematic. It may not have been an issue, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, to purely determine prayer times or whatever it is through some kind of astronomical calculation, right? Because we were so embedded in the natural rhythms, it wasn't an issue. But now it's become an existential question of survival. Our own sanity depends on the extent to which our own relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still depends on the extent to which we maintain this relationship. And so it's very important. So prayer times,
The
orientation of the Qibla. You know, I read in a book many years ago.
Facing west in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, look, getting your bearings and knowing east, west, north, south is an important part of our mental health. Psychologists have proven this.
Wow.
Knowing where the sun is, knowing north, south, east, west, your basic directions, where the wind currents are coming from. These are primordial aspects of, you know, being attuned to the natural world. There's nothing wrong with orienting yourself and trying to find the Qibla and then looking at the app to determine whether you got it right or wrong, right? I would even go far as to say, you know, forget about the app. I've known shuyukh who have said that ijtihad in this particular moment, if there's a group of people and their kind of ijtihad is overlap in that kind of a certain direction, that is fine. Because the act of searching for the Qibla itself, whereby you're orienting your heart towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a ibadah.
Wow.
Right?
That's huge.
The moment you decide,
turn,
absolutely.
That's
Where are you turning? You're turning to Allah. You're not turning to the Kaaba. You know, what did Umar say about the Kaaba? You know, or the stone, black stone. I saw Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam kiss you. I'm kissing you. I'm not doing it for your own sake. Orientation to the Kaaba in the Islamic tradition is a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because we need a certain direction to turn towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so out of mercy and compassion for us, He has given us the direction of the Holy House.
You spoke at the beginning of the podcast about being therapists in this age. And in today's age, we're seeing postmodernism present a crisis to humanity. Another crisis is the crisis of nihilism. Nothing carries meaning. And we're seeing rampant depression, anxiety. How can we take these, I guess, concepts within postmodernism and present them the Islamic solution? I know you're going there, just needed to present the question. How do we present ourselves as therapists in this regard?
I think we need to start, rooted in our own tradition, we need to start engaging with the issues and concerns that trouble the modern world. A lot of our discourse is insular, you know, to other Muslims.
Amongst each other.
We need to go back to the Quranic Ayyuhan Nas, right? That's our Islamic message is, oh people, right? Because what is desperately needed today is an alternative for humanity, unless we can help rectify things at a global level, or among communities outside the Muslim community, there's not much you can solve exclusively within the Muslim community. It's a global issue. And given that Islam is essentially a universal dispensation, we're not carrying the message in the way we're supposed to, right? We have to stop saying postmodernism is a Western problem, right? It's a global problem. It's everyone's problem now.
Muslims themselves are highly affected by postmodernism.
We
of
are.
course, we can't
There
deny it.
are
We
very
can't run
few
away
Muslims today who are traditional through and through. I mean, from the moment they're born until we're modern, postmodern, and we have to come to terms with that. But in the process, what we're trying to resolve and what we're trying to address is out of this kind of Islamic universal compassion. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. Prophet ﷺ was sent as a compassion to humanity. Compassion is a very important principle in the Quran. Ar-Rahman ala arsh istawa, mush al-Jabbar.
Yes.
There's a reason for that.
The merciful.
The compassionate one. Why? Because the governing property of existence is compassion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't need creation. Out of compassion, He brings forth things into being.
And we came into this world from mercy as well.
Absolutely. So, عباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا, right? We need to go back to embodying this quality and attribute of compassion, which is embodied in the Prophet ﷺ and his Sunnah, and it will begin to radiate out into everything we do. The primordial Sunnah, the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the amazing thing about Islamic Sharia and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is, unlike some other religious traditions where there's a lot of artificial do's and don'ts, and it's constructed by the human mind. The Sharia, which means the path to a watering hole, consists of guidelines or guidance that reorients us to being what we are intrinsically created for. It's very natural, you know. I'll give you an example I've given before. Just example of how primordial it is, and this touches on the point of how we can, if all human beings, as the Quran teaches us, are born with the fitrah. The fitrah is never completely extinguished in every human being, and so all human beings have a common ground, and we as Muslims need to work on that common ground that we have in order to reach out to others. I was sitting in a restaurant in Granada with a German delegation, and they served meat and all sorts of different foods and whatnot. And I decided to have the salad, vegetables and whatnot. Especially, you know, in Granada they have this tradition, which is unfortunate, where many of the restaurants still hang pork, and they serve a lot of pork because of it was in response to the Muslim presence in the city. But anyway, so I was very careful about how they cook the food, when. Anyway, I was asking all these questions. So as we started eating, the German delegation began asking me, you know, why aren't you eating meat? I said to them, you know, personal, philosophical, ethical reasons. I'm like, that's interesting. So they asked me, so what are the reasons? I said to them, well, you know, I mean, I really got to make sure that the animal was treated well and well fed when it was alive. You know, I want to make sure it was frolicking around in a paddock somewhere, not in a cage, right? They said, "Oh yeah, that's important. I think that's really interesting." And then they said, "Well, go on. Any other reason?" I said, "Well, I mean, I got to make sure that the animal was killed with the most minimal pain. You know, I mean, you can't kill animals in an industrial, complex manner." And they said, "Oh yeah, that's really interesting. I'm really intrigued." And so at this moment,
they're drawn in. They're drawn into.
Drawn in.
Yeah, they're drawn in.
At this moment, other members just put their knives down and began listening in. And they asked, you know, so go on. I said to them, well, you know, I mean, we have no intrinsic right to kill these animals. So I like to invoke cosmic compassion, to put myself in a state of compassion when killing this animal. It's only right to do so. And they're like, wow, that's fascinating. I never saw it that way. And I really love that philosophy. And I said to them, that's what we Muslims call halal.
Yeah, in a nutshell.
The jaws just dropped. Like, And they said to me, we've never heard. So that's what halal means? I said, well, essentially, that's what halal meat is, right? And they said, so in my mind, I could have gone about this in a very different way. I could have said, it's not halal, I don't eat it. Thereby invoking my right as a minority to separate dietary laws. When in fact, what I should have been doing, what I did do, is invoking our common, primordial, ethical principles for not eating meat. You see the difference?
Yes.
Muslims today are too caught up in demanding what is rightfully theirs as a minority. And we've forgotten that our whole tradition is not based on the rights of a minority. It's based on the right of a human being. It's based on the right of the Khalifa. It's based on the right of what is intrinsically natural to do. If you take halal, if you take every aspect of our Sharia, right, it's perfectly attuned to the nature of what is, perfectly attuned to the primordial way of being. And if we articulate it this way, no person in their right mind, except a Lahabite, who has some pernicious intrinsic hatred of the truth, right? Everyone else will find it appealing, except for someone who's hell bent on fighting the truth and Allah, and those category of people do exist, right? So not all people are Islamophobic because they hate Islam. There's a lot of misunderstanding involved, and you can really. So if we start articulating our Sharia as part of a universal human conversation about what is better for us as human beings, I think you'll get a much more interesting conversation. And what sacred text has more references to the natural world than the Quran? Right? Again, you mentioned nature, right? Our whole tradition is rooted in the natural world. And if you look at the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, I was giving a talk at a school, Islamic school, about 2 years ago here, and I was pointing out the number of himas, natural reserves set up by the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba immediately afterwards. Whenever they entered into a city like Medina and whatnot, students were surprised when they looked at the conditions of the hima, what you could and couldn't do. And I asked them, how many of us here in Australia, how many of you volunteer with the natural reserves in Sydney?
I would be surprised to see any hands up.
That's a natural extension of the Sunnah, no? There's a Sunnaic practice happening already. Of course, there's one condition that's not in a natural reserve, which is that this is set aside for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is an important condition. But everything else, all the other conditions are met, right? Why? Because we see this as a Western practice, and unfortunately you hear them, this is a kuffar society and all that nonsense. And it's a very, very pathological way of looking at things.
Yeah, I think positioning ourselves as therapists to many of the modern plagues that are happening today is crucial. Connecting with nature, I think that's a common ground. People have that respect, as you mentioned.
Even the arts as well, because from my understanding, sorry to cut you off, Kamal, is that with poets, I think poets were described as what's the word? Poets were described as psychologists as well, because what they would say, it was an understanding through what they would write and the great writings they would write. That is also a form of therapy as well.
Definitely.
Yeah. On the notion of the arts, we should be designing our Islamic structures and buildings with an eye for creating spaces that instill the very principles we want people to live by, right? Peace, harmony. Iman and aman are words that are rooted, right? Sakan and sakina, to dwell, to live, and sakina, that primordial peace that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings down. Our buildings should be places of sakina. They should be places of aman. They should be places of tranquility and peace. You shouldn't have to, like I've done many years, fight with uncles and mosques to design the wudu areas properly. It shouldn't stink and shouldn't smell. Wudu, according to some opinions, is a form of ibadah mustaqillah. It's a form of worship, right? It's you're purifying your body and simultaneously your heart in order to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exclusively. In a bathroom that stinks, with the wrong kind of material that's molding, with water coming out of the wrong kind of faucets.
Yeah, right? Kamal's been, I think, we've all had our fair share with uncles in the mosque.
Water is a sacred substance.
Yeah,
definitely. Right? It has to be treated with dignity, with respect.
100%.
Not come out of a plastic or, I don't know, I mean, I always advocate copper or some other really important material and the use of clay as much as possible in the wudu areas that have excellent ventilation, that are properly designed, not an afterthought of the engineer or the architect stuck away somewhere in the car park.
Definitely.
Right? Beauty of our structures, our mosques. Where are the gardens? You know, in a modern world that consist of urban jungles, our mosques should be sanctuaries, natural sanctuaries with gardens that Muslims and non-Muslims are drawn to. But then beyond the trees, they see the whole of the mosque and the prayer, and they hear the primordial call to prayer. That's dawah.
In essence, when we immerse ourselves in nature, the amount of times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives references to nature in the Quran. There's a plethora of ayat and verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He directs our vision towards nature. But essentially, what's the purpose? To guide us to Allah. Because all these things are called ayat, signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's, I think, definitely something which is very important for us to implement in our dawah today. Moving forward, Doctor, in light of all these conversations, in light of all these issues that we have raised, seclusion versus engagement, what's the best methodology for the modern Muslim today? I guess both avenues do have their weight in our tradition. What is the best course of action?
What practical methods
seclude?
Well,
I'm guessing I definitely sense a pro engagement.
Look, I think it's
that's interesting because I'm kind of seeing the bit of the opposite. So that's interesting.
I mean, we don't have to really struggle over this. The Sunnah provides the answer to it. Very clear, you know. There are no rahbaniyya in Islam. There's no complete seclusion, isolation in that sense. Prophetic Sunnah was maybe short temporary periods of seclusion, after which there was some serious engagement. The greatest seclusion, the greatest spiritual journey was the Mi'raj, after which he came back and engaged with the community. Or Ghar Hira, you know, he would spend, before prophecy at least, he spent a significant amount of time up there, and his wife Khadija would bring him food halfway up the mountain. But after that, he didn't spend significant amounts of time, months on end, isolated from the community. He would engage in khalwa and iqama, etc. So I think it also depends on various moments and periods in your life. We live in a period today where we're so overly socialized that we do need the occasional retreat and seclusion in order to regain some kind of sanity and peace and tranquility. Imam Ghazali's life provides an example of this.
Yeah, you know, 10 years.
He went through his, a great crisis, and 10 yeyears, it wasn't seclusion, it was siyaha. He did meet people.
Traveling?
Yeah. So he traveled in search of knowledge and in search of meeting the awliya and meeting scholars, etc. And he was partly secluded and partly engaged with a handful of people. But after this period was over, he went back to teaching. Not at the Harvard of its time, the Nizamiya, but he went back to a madrasa, which he set up, and a khanaka, where he taught a select number of students. So I would say a combination of both at various moments and periods in one's life, particularly when it doesn't affect too much your duties and responsibilities towards others. You know, if you're a single child and you have a mother and father who are elderly, and you decide to go on siyaha, and you leave them on their own, it's problematic.
Yeah. I think that answer was a good answer. I think we found the mizan. I think Kamal and I were still at opposite that. He was thinking more in, I was more out. I was thinking more in, but I think we've kind of found that
on a weekly basis you can balance between them. You know, if you go all day without, other than your prayer times, we all need moments of stillness and tranquility on a daily basis. And you know from experience, especially if you're married with kids, that if you go on for a week or two,
unfortunately.
Soon, inshallah.
Or maybe perhaps
join the club.
Enjoy that time, I guess. Yeah,
enjoy your time.
Enjoy your bachelor's life while it lasts, because it'll be very difficult, you know. But those moments are important, and the greatest kind of spiritual insights and experiences happen during those moments. And it's not just, you know, if you're picking up your WhatsApp messages every time the phone buzzes, that's not going to work. You need extended periods of time. I used to tell my students often, I used to run educational trips and tours to Italy a lot. High-end educational and spiritual.
May I ask you why Italy? Italy seems like out of all the places, Italy is kind of a shock.
Convergence of factors, and it's a place, one of the few places in the world where you get the most exquisite beauty of nature combined with the most exquisite beauty of urban form. Very few places in the world, and not just one or two places. Every single city in Italy is like that. So anyway, that's another issue. It's got a unique combination of factors, and but it takes up to, when you're traveling, it takes up to 5-6 days for you to remove yourself from the mental, psychological habits of where you were, let's say in Sydney, your daily routine. And after the 7th day, begin to experience something different. Right?
7 days.
Yeah. People go on 5-day trips. I don't know how they do it. That's not a proper siyah, right? It takes several days, right? Our body, our mind, our heart has a certain logic to it that we need to follow. I remember I used to ask the student to sit in a piazza at the end of every day for half an hour and allow the experiences of the day to sediment and settle. That half an hour extended their experience of the day by several hours. The day seemed much, much longer, and the experience is much, much deeper, right? Again, taking time to take in the experiences. If you're rushing around, checking messages, even on a retreat, that's pointless. We're not built that way, right? So we need extended period of time where we're doing nothing, right? But in that nothing, we're not literally doing nothing, you know. Contemplation is not a physical action necessarily, but it's the most profound movement of the soul. Right? And it can only happen in a moment of stillness.
Well, thank you, Dr. Samir, for joining us. We've had a riveting conversation. I know I've learned a lot from this, and I'm sure I'm going to go back and take some notes on this myself, as I wasn't able to do as much as I could as navigate this conversation. And to the viewers at home, if you'd like to have more of these conversations or to hear more of these conversations, please, do like the video, please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications as well, inshallah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for the time.